I'm Nora Bennett, 29, and the moment that should have been my happiest ended with my nephew tilting a plate and sending my graduation cake skidding across the concrete frosting, streaking like a white comet. "Eat it off the ground, Aunt Nora," he said, and the laughter that followed wasn't just a sound, it was a verdict. My mother covered her smile with 2 fingers. My sister didn't bother. No one corrected him. I set down the knife, folded the thin party apron, and walked toward the back door while the music and clinking glasses went on as if I were a guest in a stranger's yard. The words, "Congrats." Nora lay crushed under a heel, the C and N smudged into a crooked arc that looked like it was waving goodbye. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up for your own dignity, tap that like and subscribe, so this story finds the folks who need it. I had come home to Boise for a celebration after 6 years of study and night shifts, a master's degree earned 1 lab report at a time, a milestone I imagined would pull my family close around a long table. The backyard was trimmed and bright fairy lights strung from fence post to fence post, the smell of ribs drifting in the warm air, cousins chasing each other through the grass. At the center, where a cake usually sits, was my sister Carly, telling stories about her family's Florida vacation sunlight catching the gold bracelet on her wrist, everyone nodding along. My cake had been nudged to a corner by the paper plates and sweating cans of soda, a small thing you only notice if you've learned to read the room for who matters and who doesn't. When Tyler's hands tipped the plate and the porcelain shattered, I waited for the ordinary kindness that makes a home feel safe, a gentle, "that's not how we treat people," but it didn't come. My father stared down at his phone. My mother called it a joke, and the laughter rolled on. I grew up on the quiet side of town where lawns were clipped, and kindness was supposed to live on every porch where my parents believed in paying bills on time and waving to neighbors where you held the door, said thank you, and didn't ask for more than you needed. They taught me to be steady, to help first, and speak later values that fit neatly inside a small house with a big kitchen table and a church bulletin pinned to the fridge by a magnet shaped like Idaho. In high school, I learned to fix what was broken, leaky faucets, late science projects, a ride for Carly when she forgot rehearsal. And I wore that reputation like a badge because being useful felt like the closest thing to belonging. Scholarships and part-time jobs got me to Seattle, where buildings rise in glass and steel, and the buses hum past coffee shops from dawn to dusk, a city that runs on a different rhythm than the one I knew. There I work in sustainability modeling systems that save dollars and air, trying to make clean energy less of a future and more of a present. The contrast between those 2 worlds, Boise's quiet certainty and Seattle's push and reach, taught me that change doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up in the small choices you make when no one's clapping. On the day of the party, I wore a blue dress and a smile I hoped would bridge an old distance. I brought a stack of printed photos from campus, the ones where the wind catches your gown and you look like you're stepping into the next thing, and I placed them by the gift table because I wanted my parents to see what their steady daughter had built. But the room had a center and I wasn't in it, and when that cake slid and spun and came to rest with Nora bent into a smear, the sound in my head wasn't breaking glass. It was a door closing. I didn't argue, and I didn't plead. There is a certain kind of silence that isn't surrender. It's a line you stop crossing. I drove away while the sky over the foothills turned from gold to violet, the radio low, my hands fixed at 10 and 2, the road out of my hometown stretching ahead like a ribbon I could finally follow. Somewhere past the last row of streetlights, with the dark pines pressing close and the highway shouldering me west, I realized I wasn't mourning a party gone wrong. I was grieving the years I mistook usefulness for love. Seattle's first mist met the windshield before midnight, streetlights throwing long reflections onto wet pavement as I turned into my neighborhood on Capitol Hill. My apartment is the size of a shoebox with a good window, a desk stacked with yellow sticky notes, and 3 small plants that lean toward whatever light they can find. And I have always liked how quiet it is after the city settles. The phone buzzed on the table with a message from my mother. 8 words that fit the tone of the night, as neatly as the forks fit back into the drawer were done, don't ever come back. No explanation, no hesitation, just a clean edge. I made tea and sat with the steam rising, and what I felt wasn't shock so much as air filling a space that had been crowded for too long. That was when I understood the difference between leaving a place and letting a place go. I thought about the numbers I had carried for years, the mortgage I helped secure, because I had better credit, the car note I co-signed, because family pulls together the monthly drafts that left my account on schedule like obedient soldiers. Those choices had always been described in the language of love and duty, but standing there with rain tick-ticking the window, I saw them for what they were, a net with my name woven through it. The woman who moved to Seattle to model cleaner systems could do the math on her own life, and for the first time, I wanted my bank accounts to reflect the same values as my work. The next morning would bring a desk, a man in wire-rimmed glasses, and a stack of forms that changed the future without raising a voice. But that is another moment. For now, I'll leave you at the curb outside my apartment, the night air cool, the city breathing around me, my phone face down on the table, and a single sentence forming in my mind with the clarity of a line drawn in ink. Tomorrow I decide what I will and will not carry. And when I send that message, the silence that follows won't feel empty at all. The rain had barely stopped when I woke the next morning, the kind that leaves a silver sheen across the city streets and beads of water on every window. Seattle was still quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. I stood at the window holding a mug of coffee and watched the mist crawl between the buildings. The city felt alive, but I felt like someone still half asleep in another life. My mother's words from the night before were done, "Don't ever come back," still glowed on my phone screen, sharp and final. I didn't answer her message. I just set the phone face down on the counter and let the silence fill the room. For the first time in years, no one expected anything from me. There were no calls asking for help, no reminders about bills, no guilt disguised as affection. But beneath that quiet, something restless stirred the ache of memories that had never really left. When I think back, it didn't start with the cake or the laughter. It started much earlier in the small 2-story house on Maple Avenue, where the smell of laundry detergent and coffee seemed to cling to everything. I was 8 when I began to understand how our family worked. My mother would tell me, "You're the strong one, Nora. You can handle things." And I believed her. Being strong sounded like praise, even if it often meant giving up the last piece of pie or staying quiet when someone else was wrong. Carly was different. She had the kind of sweetness people wanted to protect. When she cried, Mom dropped everything to comfort her. When I cried, Mom said, "You'll be fine. You always are." It wasn't cruel, it was habit. A pattern so old that no one noticed it anymore. Dad wasn't unkind, but he drifted through our lives like a man checking boxes, work, dinner, bed. If something hurt me, he called it a phase. If something disappointed me, he called it a lesson. By middle school, the roles were set. Carly was the light. I was the anchor. When money got tight, Mom said we'd keep things simple for my birthday because Carly's dance lessons were expensive. That year, I had one cupcake with a single candle and no presents. I told myself it didn't matter. But a few months later, when Carly turned 10, the house filled with streamers and guests and a 3-layer cake. I spent most of that afternoon in the kitchen, washing dishes while she unwrapped her gifts in the living room. In high school, I became the helper everyone counted on. I drove Carly to practice, finished her homework when she forgot, cleaned up after her parties, so our parents wouldn't notice. One night, while I was studying for my SATs, Carly burst into my room with a paint-stained dress and begged me to wash it before Mom saw. I did. I stayed up past midnight scrubbing until my fingers hurt. When my test scores came back, I'd missed the scholarship cutoff by 20 points. Mom just sighed and said, "If only you'd been a little more focused." The words stung, but I didn't argue. Arguing only made things worse. So I smiled, nodded, and kept quiet the same way I did when Dad compared my trophies to Carly's art ribbons, when he said, "Your sister has heart, Nora. You're more of a thinker." It was meant as balance, not insult, but it felt like a wall between us. College was my escape. I left Boise on a crisp October morning with everything I owned packed into the trunk of an old Honda. Mom hugged me quickly. Dad told me not to cause trouble. Carly waved from the porch, already bored. I promised myself that when I came back, things would be different, that maybe success would finally earn their respect. Seattle was a shock at first. gray skies, endless coffee shops, the hum of buses on wet pavement. But it was also a place where nobody knew the Bennetts, where I could just be myself. I worked part-time at a grocery store then, in a lab juggling classes and shifts, until sleep became optional. Some nights I'd fall asleep at my desk with equations still scrawled across the page. Still, every month I sent money home, first for the mortgage, then for Carly's tuition. No one asked directly, but the hints came easily. "Your sister's struggling," Mom would say. "She's not as strong as you." By the time I finished my master's, I'd given up thousands of dollars and countless weekends trying to hold our family together. I told myself it was love that strong people take care of their own. But that belief had started to crack long before the cake hit the ground. It had cracked each time my parents smiled at Carly's stories and turned away from mine each time I came home, hoping for warmth, and found politeness instead. After graduation, when Mom called to say they were planning a party, I wanted to believe it was genuine. "We've been working on it for weeks," she said. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in years. I told myself maybe this was the moment they'd finally see me, not as the fixer or the provider, but as their daughter worth celebrating. The backyard that day looked perfect: string lights, glowing tables covered with floral tablecloths, the smell of barbecue drifting through the air. But the moment I walked in, I felt the imbalance. Carly stood in the center, surrounded by neighbors, her laughter carrying across the yard. My cake sat at the edge of a folding table, nearly melting in the sun. I should have known. When Tyler knocked the plate to the ground, the laughter that followed wasn't just a child's prank, it was a reminder of my place. I waited for a reprimand, for anyone to tell him that's not how you treat family. No one did. My mother just said, "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive." And Dad kept scrolling through his phone. That was the moment the quiet realization took hold. It wasn't anger, not even disappointment. It was understanding. Driving away that evening, I didn't cry. The sky turned deep violet over the foothills, the road unspooling like a path away from everything I had tried to earn. I thought about every dollar I'd sent, every time I'd stayed silent to keep the peace, every moment I'd mistaken endurance for love. Somewhere between Boise and the Oregon border, I began to laugh softly, not because anything was funny, but because I finally saw the truth. The strong one isn't the one who carries the most. It's the one who finally sets the weight down. By the time I crossed into Washington, the night had grown darker, the highway lined with pine shadows that blurred past like old ghosts. My car radio played a slow jazz tune, and for the first time in years, I listened without distraction. The world outside looked empty, but it didn't feel lonely. I reached Seattle close to midnight, the skyline shining faintly through the mist, and parked outside my building. My hands trembled as I turned off the engine. A yawn. Inside my apartment, the air was cool and still. I hung my coat, poured a glass of water, and sat at my desk. The clock ticked softly on the wall. I thought about the message on my phone, the one that ended with, "Don't ever come back." It was the cleanest break they'd ever given me. I knew there was more to do, decisions about money, about the loans still draining from my paycheck, but that could wait until morning. For now, I needed only the quiet. Outside, rain began again, light and steady against the glass. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and let my thoughts drift to the years ahead, ones that might finally belong to me. Somewhere between exhaustion and peace, I made a silent promise. No more proving. No more waiting for someone else to define my worth. The clock struck midnight. My phone buzzed once more, a notification from the family group chat lighting the dark screen. I didn't open it. I simply turned the phone face down, closed my eyes, and let the sound of rain wash everything else away. Tomorrow, I would make one choice that would change everything, not out of revenge, but out of release. And when I did, I knew the silence that followed would be louder than any apology I'd never received. By morning, the clouds hung low over Seattle, the sky a soft gray that made the whole city feel like it was breathing in slow motion. I wrapped my sweater tighter and opened the window, letting the smell of rain and roasted coffee drift in from the cafe below. The quiet should have been peaceful, but something inside me still trembled, a mix of exhaustion and the sharp edge of realization that comes when everything you thought was love starts to look like duty. The kitchen table held a half-empty mug, a folded blanket, and my phone still turned face down from the night before. I flipped it over, and the glow of missed calls filled the screen, my mother, my sister, and a string of unread messages from the family group chat. I didn't open any of them. I already knew what they would say. The silence between us wasn't confusion, it was control, the kind that had always kept me giving, even when there was nothing left to give. I spent the morning at my desk, the same one I'd bought secondhand when I first moved here. My laptop hummed quietly as I reviewed data charts for work numbers, blurring until they stopped meaning anything. By noon, I couldn't concentrate. I closed the computer and reached for the small notebook I'd carried since grad school, the one I used to track every dollar, every hour worked, every bit of progress that proved I was worth something. Turning to a blank page, I wrote one word at the top: enough. The sound of rain grew heavier, tapping the window in steady rhythm. I thought about the house in Boise, the mortgage I'd co-signed, the car loan I'd guaranteed for Carly, and how easily they had convinced me it was my duty. "You're the practical one," Mom used to say. "You understand how money works." And I did too well, maybe. I knew how debt wrapped itself around people, how it pulled them down. What I hadn't realized was that sometimes the rope isn't around your neck until you stop tugging. That afternoon, I made a pot of tea and sat by the window watching drops slide down the glass like thin silver lines. For years, I had been sending hundreds of dollars every month, automatic transfers I rarely looked at anymore. At first, it had been for the roof repair after that heavy winter storm. Then for Carly's car when she said she couldn't get to work without it. Every time I helped, I told myself it was temporary. But temporary had become tradition, and tradition had become expectation. I remembered the day Carly first asked for help with the car loan. She'd come over with a box of donuts and that same bright smile she always used when she needed something. "It's just, until I get my bonus," she said, leaning on my kitchen counter. "You've got great credit, Nora. You'd only need to co-sign." I hesitated, but Mom called the next day and said, "You're the strong one. We can't let your sister's family struggle." That was the phrase they always used when they wanted me to say yes. The loan papers arrived in an envelope a week later, and I signed them with the same shaky pen I used for my own student loans. I didn't think twice. It felt like the right thing to do, what family does. I was wrong. By evening, I'd made up my mind. The weight in my chest wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. I opened my laptop again and searched for the nearest branch of Green First Bank where both loans were held. There was one less than 2 miles away on Pine Street. I clicked Schedule Appointment, and when the screen asked for a reason, I typed simply, "Co-signer removal consultation." The next morning, I walked through the drizzle, the city damp and shining like it had been freshly washed. Inside the bank, the air was warm and smelled faintly of paper and ink. A woman at the counter directed me to a small glass office where a man in a navy suit stood to greet me. "Miss Bennett," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm Mr. Ortiz. Please have a seat." His voice was calm, the kind of tone that makes you feel you can speak without apology. I sat down and placed my folder on the desk, proof of address lease agreement pay stubs, and a printed email from my mother written the year before. It said, "The house is ours, Nora. You just helped sign." Mr. Ortiz read it silently, his brow tightening just slightly as he turned each page. "I've been helping my family financially for years," I said quietly. "But I'm no longer part of their household. I don't want to be tied to their debts anymore." He nodded slowly. "You've met the requirements to request a release from liability," he said. "We'll need to verify that you no longer live at the property and that the primary borrowers remain in good standing. Once confirmed, we can process the removal." Hearing those words was like opening a window after years of stale air. He dialed the bank's legal department and spoke in calm, professional tones, summarizing my case. Then he handed me a pen and turned the first page toward me. "Sign here, Miss Bennett," he said. "This begins the review." The pen trembled slightly in my hand. When I wrote my name, I felt each letter land like a small declaration. For years, I had signed documents to help others. Now, for the first time, I was signing one to protect myself. Afterward, he explained that the process would take 48 hours. During that time, all joint access to my credit profile would be frozen. If anyone tries to open a new account or loan in your name, he added, the system will reject it automatically. I nodded, grateful for his steadiness. Before I left, he said, sometimes doing the right thing looks selfish to the people who've benefited from your silence. Don't let that confuse you. Outside, the air smelled of rain and roasted chestnuts from a street cart nearby. I walked toward the corner cafe and ordered a cappuccino. The barista handed it to me with a bright smile and said, "Have a good day." I surprised myself by answering, "I will." Back in my apartment, I set the coffee on the table and turned on some quiet music. The phone buzzed again, 8 missed calls from Mom, 4 from Carly, 3 from Dad. No new messages, just the same numbers looping through the notifications. I didn't answer. I sat at the table and stared out the window instead, the steam from the cup curling into the cool air. I imagined the scene back in Boise, the confusion, the anger, the sudden panic when the automatic payment stopped and the bank started calling. I could almost hear Mom's voice rising, Carly's shock turning to blame. But the thought didn't sting the way it used to. It just felt quiet. That night I cooked a simple dinner pasta with greens and ate it slowly, one bite at a time, as if I were learning how to taste again. The rain started up once more, tapping softly against the glass. I could still see the cake from that night, broken on the patio, frosting smeared underfoot. But the image no longer carried humiliation. It was just a reminder of where the story had begun. After washing the dishes, I picked up my phone, opened the family group chat, and typed a single message. I've stopped paying for people who laughed when my cake hit the floor. Then I pressed send. The screen went still, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then one word appeared beneath my message, seen. No replies followed. No excuses, no laughter, just silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't known in years, peace. I turned off the lights and stood by the window. The city shimmered under the drizzle, its reflections scattered like tiny pieces of glass. Somewhere below, a bus hissed to a stop, and a couple walked past, holding hands under a shared umbrella. Life went on ordinary and unbothered. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't need them to understand. The only person who needed to was standing right here watching the rain slide down the glass, finally ready to start again. When I went to bed that night, the phone buzzed again, one final call before the sound stopped completely. I didn't pick it up. I just whispered into the quiet, "It's done." And somewhere deep inside, I knew tomorrow would bring the real storm, not from the sky, but from the people who had never expected me to walk away. The city had barely woken when the knock came at my door. It was sharp, heavy, and relentless. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. I froze halfway through pouring coffee, my hand trembling just enough for a few drops to spill onto the counter. When I glanced at the video intercom, the grainy screen showed 2 faces I hadn't seen in person since the day I left Boise. My mother stood front and center, her arms crossed tight against her chest, and Carly hovered just behind her eyes. Flashing hair, wild anger radiating through the camera like static. I didn't move at first. The knocking grew louder, my mother's voice cutting through the hallway. "Nora, open this door right now. We need to talk." "Behind her," Carly shouted. "You ruined everything." The bank's threatening foreclosure. Her words tangled together, sharp and fast, panic buried beneath accusation. I could hear neighbors opening their doors down the hall. I took a slow breath, set the mug aside, and stared at their blurred figures on the small screen. The old urge to open the door, to fix, to explain, to make it right, rose instinctively, but I let it pass. My phone sat on the table where I'd left it the night before. I tapped record and placed it next to the door, the red light blinking quietly. "Mom," I said through the closed door, keeping my voice steady, "you need to leave." She pounded harder. "Don't you dare tell me to leave. We are your family. You don't treat family like this. You've destroyed our lives." Carly's voice broke through, neck shrill and shaking. "You're heartless. My car is gone because of you. My fiancé's furious. I'm humiliated." The hallway filled with their noise. I could hear their shoes scuffing against the tile, the thud of a hand against the doorframe. "Nora, talk to us," Mom shouted again, her words cracking into a near plea. "We're not leaving until you do." I stepped back, thumb hovering over the 911 icon on my phone. My voice was calm when I spoke. "If you don't leave, I'll call the police. I'm not discussing this here." There was a stunned pause followed by laughter that didn't sound like laughter at all. "Oh, you'll call the police on your own mother," she said. "You've lost your mind." But I didn't respond. I pressed the call button. A calm dispatcher answered her voice, a steady contrast to the chaos on the other side of my door. "Seattle Police Department. What's your emergency?" "There are 2 people outside my apartment refusing to leave," I said evenly. "They're yelling, pounding on the door, and making threats." "Do you know them?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," I said, watching their figures through the monitor. "They're my family. But today, they're not acting like it." Within minutes, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway again, this time slower, firmer. The intercom camera showed 2 officers approaching. My mother and Carly turned toward them immediately, talking over each other, gestures flying. Even through the small screen, I could see the heat in their faces. "She's my daughter," Mom said loudly. "We just want to talk to her." Carly's voice cracked beside her. "She destroyed our finances. She needs to fix it. We're desperate." The taller officer, a man with a calm expression, held up a hand. "Ma'am, you're trespassing. If she's asked you to leave, you need to leave." My mother's eyes flashed with disbelief. "Trespassing? I'm her mother. I have rights." The officer's tone softened, but he didn't bend. "You have rights as a parent," he said, "but not the right to force your way into an adult's home. If you stay, we'll have to escort you off the property." Carly buried her face in her hands, muttering something I couldn't hear. My mother turned back toward my door, her face inches from the camera. "You'll regret this, Nora," she hissed. "Blood doesn't turn cold forever." I didn't answer. The officers guided them down the hall, their voices fading, until only silence filled the apartment again. I waited another minute before unlocking the deadbolt. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty except for the echo of their footsteps disappearing down the stairwell. The air smelled faintly of rain and hallway disinfectant. I closed the door gently and leaned my back against it, the tension draining from my shoulders in one long, shaky breath. The recording was still running. I picked up my phone and replayed it once, listening to every word. Their voices, angry, pleading, familiar, filled the room. Then I saved the file and named it Boundaries, April 17th. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, still rhythm. I sat by the window watching the city move as if nothing had happened. Cars drifted by, people walked their dogs, a man in a raincoat balanced a paper cup of coffee as he crossed the street. The normalcy of it all felt almost unreal. By evening, my phone filled with messages, again texts from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. "You embarrassed your mother. How could you do that to family? She was only trying to talk to you." I scrolled through them without replying, then deleted them one by one. Each swipe felt like setting down another heavy stone I'd carried for too long. When night fell, I opened the window. The cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet pavement and the faint sound of traffic below. The noise of the day was gone, replaced by a soft hum that felt like peace. I thought about how far they had driven, almost 500 miles, to stand outside my door and demand what they thought was still theirs. They had come expecting the same daughter who always opened the door, who always said yes, but that daughter was gone. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. I brewed coffee and sat by the window again, letting the warmth of the mug sink into my hands. Seattle felt different somehow, brighter, lighter, as if the air itself had noticed that I was free. At work, the routine steadied me. My desk at Green Pulse Tech faced a row of tall windows overlooking the water. I spent hours modeling data tracing numbers that measured emissions and progress things that could be changed with logic and patience. In the lab, the world made sense. You put in the work and results followed. People didn't always work that way. When I came home that evening, Mrs. Alvarez, my landlord, was watering the plants in the hallway. "Everything okay, dear?" she asked, glancing up. Her voice carried that quiet kindness you don't realize you need until it finds you. "Yes," I said with a small smile. "Everything's fine now." She nodded as if she understood more than I'd said. "Sometimes peace isn't about quiet," she said softly. It's about closing the right door. That night I cooked dinner and set the table for one. The city lights shimmered outside, reflecting off the surface of Lake Union. I thought about my family somewhere back in Boise, their lives unraveling in ways I could no longer fix. I didn't feel anger or victory, just calm. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote one line across the page. Sometimes the only way to be respected is to stop begging for it. The words sat there in the lamplight, simple and final. I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the quiet fill the room. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the windows in soft rhythm. It no longer sounded like a storm. It sounded like release. The next morning would bring the start of something new, peace I hadn't earned from forgiveness, but from finally standing still. 3 months passed before I noticed how quiet my life had become. Not the kind of quiet that follows a fight heavy and uncertain, but the kind that settles slowly like sunlight through a half-open curtain. Seattle had slipped into summer warm and bright, the air carrying the scent of salt from the Sound and roasted coffee from the cafes on every corner. Most mornings began the same way, a jog along the water, a shower, a pot of coffee, and the comfort of knowing that no one expected anything from me. Work at Green Pulse Tech had grown busier with new projects rolling in. Julia, our CEO, had asked me to lead a team designing sustainable systems for a development site in Portland. It was the kind of work I'd always dreamed of, complex, steady, full of purpose. When I presented our model at the end of June, Julia smiled and said, "You're the kind of leader people trust, Nora. You don't have to shout to be heard." Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. Outside of work, I began building a new rhythm. On weekends, I met up with Erin, my old friend from grad school, who now managed outreach at a nonprofit for solar initiatives. She brought fresh bread or a bottle of wine, and I'd make soup or pasta. We'd talk late into the evening about workbooks or the plants on my balcony that refused to grow straight. Her laughter filled the small apartment in a way that made it feel like home. Then there was Michael, my colleague, and the closest thing I had to a brother. We'd grab coffee during breaks, walk the shoreline at lunch, or swap playlists while working late. One afternoon, as we reviewed a presentation, he glanced at my phone when another email from Boise flashed across the screen. "You don't owe anyone your piece," he said softly, then went back to typing. The simplicity of it caught me off guard, and for a long moment, I couldn't reply. Mrs. Alvarez, my landlord, often appeared at my door around 5 o'clock with a cup of masala chai, her warm eyes filled with quiet understanding. The first time I told her about my family, she listened without interrupting, then said, "Family isn't always the people who share your blood. It's the ones who see you without asking you to shrink." I wrote that down later in my journal, beneath a note that simply said, "Freedom equals clarity." Over time, the apartment began to change with me. The walls that once felt bare now held photos of friends, places I'd been, small memories that belonged only to me. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic more often than takeout, and the balcony, now home to 3 thriving plants, had become my favorite place to end the day. Each evening, I'd sit outside with a cup of tea, watching the city lights ripple across Lake Union. The world no longer felt like something I was surviving. It felt like something I was part of. One Saturday morning, while reorganizing the shelves, I found the old photo from my graduation. In it, I stood in front of the university building, wind catching my gown, my smile still full of hope. I placed it in a frame and set it by the window next to a small cactus I'd picked up from Pike Place Market. The cactus had grown slightly crooked, its spines sharp, but its tiny blossoms pale and beautiful. It seemed fitting. That afternoon, Erin and Michael came over for lunch. We ordered pizza, spread out on the floor, and flipped through old photos on my laptop. When Michael saw the graduation picture, he laughed softly. "You look like you were about to conquer the world," he said. I smiled back. Maybe I was just learning how to survive it. The room filled with quiet laughter, the kind that warms without effort. For a long while, none of us spoke, just the sound of the city humming outside and the clink of coffee cups on the table. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, I found myself thinking about Boise. It no longer ached the way it once did. It was just a place I had come from, not the one I belonged to anymore. Every few weeks, I'd still get an email from my mother, short-clipped messages about the house or her health, but I never replied. I read them once, then folded them away like old receipts, reminders of something I no longer needed to revisit. One night, while tidying my desk, I came across a folded note I had written months earlier the day I signed the papers at the bank. Freedom isn't revenge, it's clarity. I smoothed the edges and pinned it back to the wall beside a photo of me, Aaron, and Michael from our recent trip to the Oregon coast. We were standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, hair wind-blown faces bright with laughter. I looked at that picture and realized how far I had come from the woman who once measured her worth in other people's gratitude. The following week, work took me to Portland for 3 days. During the drive back with the radio low and the highway stretching ahead, I felt a strange stillness settle in. Not emptiness, something quieter. Like a door inside me had finally closed without bitterness or regret. By the time I reached Seattle, the sky had turned gold and the city skyline shimmered on the horizon. When I walked into my apartment, the air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle Mrs. Alvarez must have lit while I was gone. A small note rested on my counter in her neat handwriting. "Welcome home, Nora. The plants missed you." I smiled, placed the note on the fridge, and opened the balcony door. The evening breeze drifted in soft and cool. It was then that I understood something I hadn't before, that peace doesn't arrive like a gift. It's something you build one choice at a time until the noise around you fades and all that's left is your own steady breath. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed on the table. It was an email from Boise. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I didn't open it. Instead, I let the screen dim, the message disappearing into the quiet light of the room. The wind outside carried the faint smell of rain, and somewhere across the lake, a ferry horn sounded, a low, distant note fading into the dark. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, knowing that the calm I had fought for wasn't fragile anymore. It would hold. Still, a small thought lingered at the edge of my mind. They wouldn't give up easily. The silence wouldn't last forever. And when the next storm came, I needed to be ready to meet it on my terms this time. It was late August when the peace I'd built began to tremble. I was making coffee one morning when my phone buzzed with message after message, the screen lighting up like a warning flare. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize, people I hadn't spoken to in years. "Are you okay? Call me when you can. Saw something online." The last one came from Aaron, followed by a screenshot. At the top was my mother's Facebook profile, her name bold above a long post. "Sometimes the child you trust the most ends up betraying you," it read. "My oldest daughter stole from her parents and destroyed our credit. Some people never learn gratitude." Beneath it, hundreds of comments, old neighbors, distant relatives, even old classmates offered sympathy or joined in with their own speculation. A few accused me directly, saying I'd used my family's money to fund my fancy Seattle life. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. For a moment, I couldn't feel anything. Not anger, not sadness, just a strange kind of stillness. My coffee had gone cold by the time I set the phone down. The city outside carried on cars moving through the drizzle, people hurrying under umbrellas. None of them knew that in a few lines of text, my mother had rewritten the story of my life. By noon, the post had spread beyond Boise. I received messages from coworkers, polite, cautious notes, asking if everything was all right. The kind of messages that carry curiosity behind concern. I opened my laptop, wrote a short email to my team and HR. "If you see rumors or posts about my family, please ignore them. Some people resist boundaries by spreading lies. I'm fine and appreciate your professionalism." I read it twice before sending. It wasn't an explanation. It was closure. That evening I met Michael at a small cafe near the office. The air smelled of rain and roasted beans, the kind of scent that usually calmed me. He slid into the booth across from me, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "I saw the post," he said quietly. "You don't have to talk about it, but I wanted to check in." I nodded, tracing the rim of the cup with my finger. "I'm okay," I said, though the words felt like a thin thread. He studied me for a moment, then said, "People lose their power over you the moment you stop reacting." His tone wasn't advice, it was understanding. I looked up and managed a small smile. "Then I guess I'm done reacting." Over the next few days, the storm online grew louder. The post was shared, reworded, twisted into new shapes. Some people defended me, others didn't. My inbox filled with questions that read more like judgments, but I kept my silence. Each day I showed up to work, led my team, finished reports, and went home. A few afternoons later, as I sat in a meeting with Julia, her assistant stepped in holding an envelope. "This just arrived for Miss Bennett," she said. Julia handed it to me with a raised brow. The envelope bore the logo of Green First Bank. Inside was an official statement signed by Mr. Ortiz himself. It confirmed that I had been fully released from all co-borrower liability and that the loans were now solely under the names of Diane and Carly Bennett. The document was clean-stamped and final. I exhaled slowly, the tightness in my chest easing for the first time in weeks. After scanning the paper, I forwarded a copy to HR, not for defense, but for record. When I looked up, Julia was still watching me. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Everything's just fine now." That night when I got home, I noticed the post had vanished. My mother's profile was still there, but the words were gone, replaced by silence. Whether she'd deleted it herself or someone had pressured her, I didn't know. It didn't matter. The truth had found its way back into daylight. The next morning, a message from Mrs. Richards appeared in my inbox, the woman who'd lived next door to us when I was a child. Her note was short and gentle. "I saw what your mother wrote, dear. I know it isn't true. You were the hardest working girl on our street. I'm proud of you." I read it 3 times before replying, "Thank you. That means more than you know." For the first time in months, I walked to work without feeling the weight of what my family had done. The city air felt clean, the sidewalks washed from last night's rain. When I arrived, Michael met me in the lobby and handed me a cup of coffee. "You look lighter," he said. "I am," I answered, and I meant it. Days turned into weeks. The messages from Boise slowed, then stopped. Even Aaron mentioned that the post had become old news. It was strange how quickly people moved on once there was no reaction to feed on. In their silence, I found peace again. One evening, as the sun lowered over Lake Union, I sat on my balcony with a cup of chamomile tea, the city glowing in soft amber light. The air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine from a neighbor's window box. I thought about everything that had happened, the laughter at the party, the slammed doors, the accusations, and realized how far away it all felt now. Inside my journal lay open on the desk. I picked up a pen and wrote, "Silence isn't weakness. It's the storm they never realized they lost." The words filled the page cleanly without hesitation. I pinned the note to the wall beside my other reminders next to the photo from the coast. That night, as I cleaned up the kitchen, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately. "We're struggling with the house. Call us, please." I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. The sound of the city drifted through the open window cars, passing a distant ferry horn, the hum of life continuing on. When I went to bed, the light from the street lamp fell across the cactus by my window. Its blossoms had opened again, small and white against the dark. I reached out and touched one gently, the petals soft beneath my fingertips. It was quiet, truly quiet, and for the first time I didn't mistake that quiet for loneliness. It was peace. Earned, steady, and mine. Still deep down, I knew peace rarely lasts forever. There was one connection still waiting in the shadows of my past, one voice I hadn't heard since the day I left Boise. It wouldn't stay silent for long. It was early November when my phone rang again, a number I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. I almost ignored it, but something, maybe the late hour, maybe the way it lingered, made me pick up. "Nora." The voice was quiet, older and gentler than I remembered. It was my father. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city outside was wrapped in fog, the kind that softened everything it touched. "Dad," I finally said. "It's me," he answered, and there was a long pause. "I didn't know if you'd even pick up." His tone carried something I hadn't heard in a long time, humility. He told me he was in Seattle for a conference just 2 miles from my apartment and that he wanted to see me before he left. "It doesn't have to be long," he said, "just coffee. 5 minutes if that's all you can stand." His words landed softly like someone who knew they didn't have the right to ask for much. I agreed more out of curiosity than forgiveness. We chose a small cafe near Lake Union 1 with wide windows and quiet corners. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray. I arrived early and took a seat by the window. My father walked in 10 minutes later, the same man I remembered, but smaller somehow, as if life had taken a little of the weight from his shoulders. His hair was grayer, his tie slightly loose, and when our eyes met, he smiled an unsure, tired kind of smile. He sat across from me, clasping his hands on the table. "You look good," he said. "Healthy." I nodded, offering a polite smile. The silence stretched until he took a deep breath. "Your mother told me what happened. I should have called sooner, but I didn't know how." I stirred my coffee, watching the steam rise between us. "You didn't have to," I said quietly. "It's over now." "I know," he replied. "And I know I failed you. I didn't stop her when I should have. I thought keeping the peace was helping everyone, but I see now it only hurt you more." His voice caught for a moment, and I saw his hands tremble slightly. "I never wanted sides, Dad," I said. "I just wanted respect." He nodded slowly, eyes lowered. "You deserve that, and more." Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this. It's not money, don't worry," he said with a faint, embarrassed smile. Inside was a photograph me at 8 years old, sitting on his shoulders at the county fair. My hair was wild from the wind, and we were both laughing, faces turned toward the Ferris wheel behind us. "I kept this on my desk for years," he said. "Your mother wanted me to throw it out when things fell apart, but I couldn't. I thought maybe one day I'd get the chance to tell you I'm proud of you." For a long time I didn't say anything. The air between us felt different now, heavy, but not cruel. "Thank you," I said, finally slipping the photo back into its envelope. "That means more than you know." He nodded and smiled, a quiet relief crossing his face. We talked for nearly an hour about his work about Seattle, about nothing important and everything that mattered. Before leaving, he said softly, "I know I can't fix the past, Nora, but if you ever want to talk again, I'll be here." Then he stood, placed a few bills on the table, and left without looking back. When the door closed behind him, I sat there for a long time watching the ripples of rain slide down the window. The photo rested in my palm edges, slightly worn from time. For years I'd imagined this kind of conversation always ending in anger or tears, but instead it had ended in something simpler, a beginning. That evening, as the rain eased, I walked down to the lake. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Across the water, the lights of the city shimmered faintly, reflecting in small broken lines. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket and watched the ripples fade. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to follow. My father emailed me occasionally short, careful notes about work or small memories he'd uncovered. I replied sometimes, other times not, but the balance between us was quiet and steady. It was enough. Then one afternoon in December, another message arrived, not from him, but from Carly. Her name on the screen sent a flicker of unease through me. The message was just 3 words, "I'm so sorry." I stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was a trap or a truth. A second message followed minutes later. "I finally understand." I didn't respond. Instead, I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your breath visible. Christmas lights hung in the windows of shops along the street, and families hurried by with shopping bags, their laughter trailing through the air. I passed a bookstore window displaying a quote painted across the glass. "Sometimes closure isn't about answers, it's about peace." I stopped to read it twice before continuing on. When I returned home, the apartment felt warm, the smell of cinnamon tea drifting from the kitchen. Mrs. Alvarez had left a small basket at my door, 2 oranges, a candle, and a note that read, "Happy holidays, dear. You deserve calm." I smiled, carried it inside, and set it on the table beside the cactus which had bloomed again. That night, I took out the envelope from my father and placed the photo in a frame on the shelf. The laughter frozen in that picture looked like something out of another lifetime, yet somehow still mine. I sat by the window watching the lights shimmer across the water and realized that peace doesn't always come in the form of apologies. Sometimes it's a simple act of remembering who you were before the hurt. As midnight approached, my phone buzzed once more. A final message from Carly appeared. "Mom isn't well. She's asking for you. I didn't open it right away." The room was quiet except for the faint sound of wind against the glass. I looked at the framed photo, then out toward the city lights, and knew that whatever I decided next would close the last open door between the life I had survived and the one I was still building. When I finally opened Carly's message, the air in the apartment felt still. "Mom isn't well. She's asking for you." The words sat there small and heavy. For a long time, I just watched the screen, unsure what I felt, anger, worry, or nothing at all. It had been nearly 2 years since that night in Seattle when she pounded on my door shouting through the wood. Now her voice reached me only through a quiet line of text. I thought about ignoring it. I'd done that before letting her words fade into the background of my new life. But something in the message felt different, less sharp, almost human again. I called my father instead. He answered quickly, his voice low and tired. "Your mother's been in the hospital," he said. "Her heart's acting up. She keeps asking if you'll come." The drive to Boise was long, the kind of drive where time folds in on itself. I hadn't seen those highways since the day I left, but every mile looked the same fields of wheat, the slow stretch of open land, and the mountains that rise like old memories on the horizon. When I finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, the sun had dipped low, painting everything in amber light. My father met me in the hallway outside her room. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his smile was steady. "She's been waiting," he said. I nodded and stepped inside. My mother lay propped against white pillows, her skin pale under the soft hospital light. For a moment, she didn't notice me. Then her eyes lifted, and she froze. "Nora," she whispered, her voice thin but clear. "You came." I took the chair beside her bed. The silence that filled the room wasn't the old brittle kind, it was quiet, cautious, alive. "How are you feeling?" I asked softly. She gave a small laugh that turned into a cough. "Like someone who finally ran out of ways to win," she said. I looked at her, unsure how to answer. She reached for the edge of her blanket, fingers trembling. "I read your name in the paper last month," she went on. "Your company's doing well." I kept the article. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I know I can't fix what I did," she said finally. "I thought keeping the family together meant keeping you small. I was wrong." Her hand drifted toward mine, stopping halfway. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say that." The clock ticked softly in the corner, steady and patient. I looked at the woman who had once made me feel invisible and saw for the first time not power, but fragility. "You don't have to explain," I said. "Some things just end. But thank you for saying it." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You sound like your grandmother," she murmured. Then she leaned back, exhaustion washing over her face. I sat with her until her breathing slowed into sleep. Outside the room, my father waited by the vending machine. "You did good," he said quietly. "She's been carrying that for a long time." I nodded, too tired to speak. That night I stayed at a small inn near the river. The window opened to the sound of water moving over stones, steady and constant. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of silence, the confrontation, the hurt that had burned so deep it became its own language. I realized I hadn't come back for her forgiveness or even to grant mine. I'd come to close the door with peace instead of anger. In the morning, I stopped by the hospital one last time. My father was reading at her bedside. He looked up and smiled when I entered. "She's resting better," he said. I nodded and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table, simple, quiet enough. Then I turned to him. "Take care of yourself, Dad," I said. He stood, gave me a brief hug, and whispered, "You too, sweetheart." The drive back to Seattle felt lighter. When I crossed the state line, the air seemed to shift, the familiar gray sky, waiting like an old friend. At home, Mrs. Alvarez had left a note taped to my door. "Welcome back, dear. The plants missed you again." Inside, the cactus had bloomed small white flowers opening toward the window. I stood there for a long time, the stillness of the room wrapping around me like something whole. That evening, I brewed tea and sat on the balcony. The city lights shimmered on the water, reflecting in soft waves. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who tried to earn love by carrying everyone else's burdens, and how far she had traveled to find peace. I wasn't the daughter who stayed silent anymore. I wasn't the fixer or the forgotten one. I was simply myself, and that was enough. Before bed, I took out the photograph my father had given me, the two of us at the fair, frozen in a moment before life got complicated. I placed it beside the cactus on the windowsill, letting the light from the street lamp touch its edges. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or grand gestures. Sometimes they end quietly, with a simple truth that walking away doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you finally started caring for yourself. And that kind of peace, the one you build, protect, and choose every day, is the most honest kind of justice there is. If this story found a place in your heart tonight, take a moment to share it or leave a thought below. Maybe it'll remind someone out there that peace isn't weakness. It's finally knowing when to stop fighting for what was never fair.